Welcome to the Bible Feed podcast, a place of conversations about the Bible and faith in the modern world, where ordinary people come together to help each other understand the Bible better. Let's get started.
Hi, for our last podcast of 2020, we're bringing you one of the first discussions we recorded when lockdown started in the UK in March 2020. It seems like an age ago now, but also, strangely, just like yesterday, when we were just getting to that point of the first lockdown haircut. The subject of this discussion is why read the Bible, which seemed relevant at the beginning of lockdown when many perhaps had a bit more time on their hands, but still seems relevant now as we go into a new year in a world very much still in the grip of uncertainty. And so, whatever 2020 has been like for you, whether it's given you sadness or joy or additional stress and strain, perhaps it's comforting to know that the still small voice of the divine, revealed through an ancient text, will always be there waiting for us to listen to it. So we hope you enjoy this discussion, and we wish you all the best for 2021.
My name's Dan, and today I've got John and Paul with me to discuss this topic. So, hi, John.
Good evening.
How are you?
Yeah, all right, thank you. Yeah, very well. Today, I was just mentioning, has been a first lockdown haircut, which has been mildly entertaining. So,
so you stay in that angle. So,
I will not be turning from the right to the right hand or the left.
No, very good. Okay, and Paul, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. The lockdown beard, or Movid, or Bovid, or whatever it's called, is coming along.
It's coming along very nicely. Excellent. Thank you both very much for joining me. I'm quite looking forward to this one because I get to ask you both all the questions. We're going to be thinking and having a conversation about reading the Bible, about why you two read the Bible, and hopefully that'll be useful for everyone else, everyone watching, and anyone else who catches up with this later. So that's what we're going to talk about. Let's get started straight in then. So the Telegraph reported in 2017, so not that long ago, that more than half of all those who identified as Christian across all denominations admitted that they never read the Bible. So that's as part of a survey in 2017. And a little bit more recently to this, the Premier Christian News reported in January last year that Christian millennials, their attitude to the Bible is that 9% of practicing Christians said they read it every day, 13% a few times a week, 13% said every week, and 17% said they read it a few times a year, meaning around 51% of practicing Christian millennials read it less than once a month. So, I mean, there's a couple of statistics there. We can probably turn to all sorts of different statistics. So, John, I think you qualify as a millennial. I think I do as well. What sort of millennial are you, John? How much do you read the Bible?
So, I think the answer to that would probably be it depends. But I would say I sit between the kind of every day to a few times a week kind of individual at the moment. And I think actually during lockdown, it's been slightly different for me than it would be normally. Because I guess I think you asked the question, which is how often do I read the Bible? So that would probably be a slightly different answer to how often I would hear it, for example. So often if I run, and like when I used to get the tube into work in London, I'd often listen to it on a commute. So the answer to how many times would I read, it's probably lower than the amount of times I would digest it, if you see what I mean.
Okay, yeah. So engaging with the Bible in different ways.
Exactly that, yeah. And I think that's probably something that if you take a kind of wider sweep of history, the concept of reading the Bible for a lot of history has been something that they often haven't been able to do. And we're really privileged to be able to do it in all sorts of different ways and that kind of thing. And I think the other thing I often do as a member of a faith community is you read it in community as well. So we'll read it on a Sunday morning. We have a Bible study class where I attend on a Wednesday, so we read it together then. And then I'd read it privately. I'd read my 18-month-old daughter like stories about the Bible, but it's all kind of absorbing the Bible in different forms, I think, for me. So that's I guess the answer to what kind of millennial are you?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So probably, yeah, you read the Bible a little bit more than the average millennial, I guess. Paul, I don't know if you qualify as a millennial, do you? Or are you?
I'm pretty sure I don't qualify as a millennial.
It's all right. We would still want to hear from you. So.
But nevertheless, I still really appreciate the blessing that I guess that we have in this age and in this country of having the Bible is never been more accessible in all those different ways that John has described some in terms of audio or and apps on your phone and tablets. Careful not to drop brand names into the into the conversation, but for me, I'll use an analogy, and I'll characterize my Bible reading as slinging mud against a wall. It's maybe not quite the right analogy, maybe taking it slightly out of context. But the saying, just the more mud you sling at the wall, some of it will stick, and that's my head, my brain, my memory is the wall, and as long as I keep slinging it at it, then some of it will stick, some of it will stay in my memory, I think the analogy works on a number of levels. Sometimes the mud's dry, and it doesn't. Sometimes it's wet, and it sticks nicely. And sometimes I just get tired of it and stop for a while. So that is, it tends to be small chunks, a bit random, not very well structured, and sometimes there's a pause, and I don't read as much for a while, and then I pick it up again. And if we look at, I guess, what the Bible says about it itself and how people have engaged with it in the past, there's lots of examples of people looking at the Bible on a regular basis, just daily meditation, whether it's the psalmist saying that he's meditating on the law, on the word of God day and night, or the Bereans who are searching the scriptures daily. But I think John made a good point about it's a very modern thing for us to think about reading the Bible as we're sat in our chair with, whether it's or listening to it or whatever, and we just sat there on our own reading it. And maybe that's for the past 150 years, that's probably the most common way of reading it. But prior to that, the vast bulk of human history in largely oral societies where levels of literacy have not been as high as they are today, then people are hearing it read or reading it aloud to each other. And that's certainly the examples you see in Old Testament and New Testament. And actually, that is a really positive way of engaging with the Bible.
Good.
It's always helpful.
Just on that, there was something I guess I've become more aware of as I've read the Bible over the last 15 or 20 years. And that's sometimes how, to the point that we kind of touched on twice, that I think it's if you look in the Gospels, which are records about the life of Jesus, the way that he talks to the common people, many of whom couldn't read, and talks to the kind of religious elites who could read is different. So he'll say often to big crowds of people, many of whom couldn't read, "Have you not heard?"
Yeah.
And then he'll say to people who are sort of scribes or religious people who could read, "Have you not read?" And so there does seem to be this distinction that in that era, there was this kind of, many people would hear the word, the Bible, or the Bible as we would call it, orally, and some would hear it or read it. And Jesus makes that distinction. So it's just another little tip.
And actually, the question that Jesus asked on a number of occasions is, how do you read?
Yeah.
So for those that are in the privileged position of being able to read it for themselves and therefore reading it aloud to others that can't do that, they've got to be really careful how they're reading it.
We're going to get onto that for sure, either tonight or some other time. How you read it. It's a big old book, so there's lots of ways you could pick it up and read it and run with it. So, but okay, good. So you both have had quite a lot of experience reading the Bible, consuming the Bible, engaging with the Bible one way or another, individually, in community, and in various different ways. So you sort of qualified for me to ask you questions about it, and to try to explore the question, why? Why do you read the Bible, and why should anyone read the Bible? That's really what we're sort of exploring tonight. What is it? What's the purpose of the Bible? So that's what we want to think about. So just following on from that same survey, the Premier Christian News report from last January, they cited a couple of reasons that why people most gave as reasons for engaging with the Bible. And they were mostly to comfort me, was one response, 30% of those, and 29% said to inspire me. So they picked up the Bible, or they sat down and they listened to something, or whatever, however they did it to be comforted or to be inspired. So John, first of all, is the Bible a comforting book to read?
Yeah, I guess it's one of those questions. It's tricky to answer on behalf of everyone, but for me personally, I would say the answer is probably a bit of yes and a bit of no. And I would say perhaps I can give a couple of examples actually that might be
Sure.
worth just thumbing through. So there are some parts of the Bible or some principles that you read about in the Bible that are, I would say, very comforting. So maybe why don't we try? There's one in the New Testament in the letter to that's called Hebrews, Hebrews chapter 13, and verses sort of 5 and 6. So I would say this is an example of words that I would find comforting, and I think probably a lot of people do. So it talks about at the end of verse 5. It's actually a quotation from part of the Jewish scriptures, or the Old Testament as it's sometimes called. Second half of Hebrews 13 verse 5, for he himself as God has said, I will never desert you, nor will I forsake you, or nor will I ever forsake you, so that we can confidently say, the Lord is my helper, I will not be afraid, what will man do to me? So that's an example of where I would say for most people reading that's very comforting. And there's other passages that maybe on first read don't sound comforting, but I would say probably are. So I've got one other example of this, and then I'll give you one that isn't, and then maybe we could chat about them. So Mark chapter 15 would be an example of a passage which is in the life of Jesus, which I find very comforting, and perhaps particularly at the moment in light of the virus. So it's quite a tricky question, and it's not one for tonight, around kind of why bad things happen. That's a very common kind of question that believers and non-believers have, isn't it? I think it's not an unreasonable question to ask. And actually, in this instance, in Mark 15, Jesus is on the cross. It's when he dies. And in that moment, while he's on the cross, he cries out in verse 34, and it gives you a bit of text that's in the language that Jesus probably then spoke, Aramaic or Hebrew or something like that. Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. And it explains that translated as, my God, why have you forsaken me? So that's quite a hard verse to read in the first instance. But when I think you think about it and go back and see what Jesus might be doing, it would seem to me that Jesus knew intellectually that God was there, but maybe didn't emotionally feel like that at this particular point. And I can sympathize a lot with that sometimes I have a faith that believes that God is there, but sometimes you can't see him or know that he's doing so, or maybe why is this all happening at the moment? And you don't know. And for me to see Jesus going through that is quite comforting. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So on the surface, you read it. This is a description of someone dying by one of the most sort of evilest forms of execution ever known to man.
Yeah.
And he's crying out, "My God, why have you forsaken me?"
Yeah.
And you think, well, how on earth is that a comforting thing? Well, it isn't really, if that's all it was. But actually, you're sort of thinking it through, that if even Jesus felt like that, then if I feel like that, then okay, that might give me a shred of comfort.
Yeah, exactly that. So that's probably one where it's a good example of actually pausing and thinking about what the Bible says in this instance is maybe a useful thing. But I guess to the question you asked earlier, which was, is it comforting? There are some parts of the Bible which I would say I don't get any comfort from reading, and I think they're quite gruesome to read. So,
go on then.
Say again, sorry.
Go on then. You share as one. Not in detail.
So probably some of the chapters in Judges in the Old Testament are vile to read. Like they detail rape and sexual abuse and civil war, and it's a literal bloodbath, and it is, I think, horrible to read. And I remember reading some of it as a child, and you're a bit like, this isn't nice. Yeah. So I'd say that's an example of a passage where I wouldn't find that remotely comforting, more alarming than anything else, and like horrible. I think maybe when I was a kid, some of the kind of, there's some like wars that are detailed. You get a sort of, maybe it's just a little boy thing. You think, oh, it's really exciting battles and stuff. But then there's these other, like when you really think about it, it's kind of tough to read. So I think hopefully that gives you an idea of just, I do find some of it comforting. I find other bits not comforting at all, and I don't think they're supposed to be. And I think maybe that is a factor that perhaps sometimes we can come to the Bible with some expectations that we want it to all be maybe nice and light and fluffy and makes you just feel warm inside. And I think if we say that, we're simply not doing justice to a lot of the detail in the book, or the books more widely. I get that. So the purpose of the Bible isn't necessarily there just to give us a bit of comfort. It's not there as a comfort blanket. It may do that, and that's the sort of, a few steps along the line. It may give you comfort having thought it through and what it's trying to sort of present to you. But yeah, when you turn up the Judges, or you turn up the account of the flood, or you turn up other, all sorts of different things, and you think, actually stop and think about it. This is this kind of thing. Yeah. And again, that's not a problem with the Bible. It's probably just a problem with some of the expectations you might bring to it. And I think it would be wrong not to say this. I think the purpose of Christianity is one to provide comfort and hope and reassurance and a brilliant future and comfort now. But that's different to saying that the Bible as a whole is comforting in every single part of it, because it simply isn't.
Yeah. Okay. Good. So most people turn to the Bible to be comforted, but a lot of people turn to the Bible to be inspired to go on and maybe do something. Paul, how does the Bible inspire you?
Again, it's quite a personal question, and the answer will be different for different people. It certainly can inspire, but it can do all sorts of things. It can comfort. It can, and often when it's providing comfort, it's providing a challenge as well, as John has illustrated. There's a lot of great literature in there. There's some cracking stories, and you can see in some of the very vivid characters painted with the good guys and the bad guys, often very clearly painted in the narrative of the accounts of the Bible, and you can see how storytelling and has developed from some of the type of characters and accounts in the Bible. You can look at the language and delight in the sort of imagery and the word pictures that are used. It also confuses me quite a lot. It gives us insights into human nature and psychology and human condition and so on. But what I think is the aspect that most people probably find inspiring at some level are the characters, are the people that are described in the narratives, because they're not superhero stories. They're not Marvel characters. The characters in the Bible, they're often shown to be very human, and the narrative seems to go out of its way to point out the failures and the flaws of the characters in the Bible, and it shows them as struggling with understanding their place in the world, their relationship with God, and all of that is very easy to connect with and engage with. But somehow through all of that, it's pointing towards someone who isn't flawed. We read about the prophets kind of looking and inquiring as to how their experiences were pointing forward to the one that was to come, who was going to get it right, even though everyone else had failed, pointing to the Messiah. I guess, how do we get inspiration from the scriptures? There are top-down. Some people look at things kind of on a top-down basis, and some people like to build it up from the detail, bottom-up. I tend to come from the top-down, and one of the most inspiring things for me is the grand narrative of the Bible, if you like, if I can call it that, which is essentially for human beings to reflect the image of God. I mean, that's the grand narrative and purpose, if ever there was one. But through the stories, through the narrative of the Bible, you repeatedly have people failing to do that, and you kind of travel that journey with them. And Adam and Eve, are you going to get it right? No, you failed. Abraham, are you going to get it right? No, you seem to have made a mistake there. Isaac, Jacob, now you're deceiving people. All these characters come through in the narrative, and you want them to kind of succeed, and then they fail. And the kings, whether it's David or Hezekiah, each time it's a roller coaster of these characters failing, and each time there's a new character emerging. You think, will this one get better? Will this be the one that achieves it? And through all of that, you want to get involved. That's what I think is inspiring. You want to be involved in that narrative and somehow be a part of humanity coming to a state where it can reflect the image of God. So the result is this grand storyline that just draws us in. And invites us to join in. Okay, good. Yeah, so inspiration or inspired by the Bible as a whole, I suppose, is what you're saying. Rather than necessarily, going right down to an individual character and saying, "Oh, they did this, they acted in this way, therefore that's what I need to do in that situation." That's kind of what you're. Yeah, I a bit of a distinction. In each of those individual characters, some of them might particularly resonate with an experience that we're having, and you can relate to it and draw inspiration from that individual character. But I guess we do so because it's part of the overall direction of travel, if you like, of the narrative. Yeah. Is there any? Oh, go on. I was just going to say, I guess I'm not someone who's read every single kind of holy book in the world, and by any stretch, and there might be some people on the line who have, or you chaps might have more than I. But I think to the point that Paul has made, it's probably one of the relatively unique features of the biblical text that they are so honest about people. Yeah. That often to the word you use, Paul, around it's like superheroes, they're very often flawed heroes, and they have real
like human challenges, and that I think is definitely something that, particularly if you read the life of Jesus, his closest followers are often the people that fail the most in the narrative, which is certainly a very interesting factor to think about in a holy book, because normally if you think about holiness as a concept, you'd expect everything to be good, and actually, to your point, Paul, it's invariably not.
It's certainly painting the world as it is, but with this sort of meta narrative, this grand narrative flowing through it, that's one of the things that makes you think this is more than just a collection of that have been brought together over time. You know, as there's a librarian or a brought it together. It's something that is designed to fit together and tell a story.
Is there anywhere in the Bible that you can think of that explains how we should be reading it? You know, how it should be read itself? Does it explain that? That's because you sort of go on.
It is an important thing to think about and to consider. Because to some extent you can come to the Bible and you can almost just make it what you want it to be. And you know, history is littered with examples of that. And you know, we all live in England, familiar with the Church of England. And Henry VIII, well, he used the Bible. He came to the Bible and said, well, how can I use this to kind of overthrow the authority of the Pope, who's telling me I can't get a divorce? So there is
weaponizing it.
And we refer to, you know, Jesus says, how do you read? How do you read it? It's a challenge to a lawyer.
So what's it for then? So it's this. So we've kind of, I mean, it's hard to do on a short sort of evening webinar, but we've painted a bit of a picture of this big book full of lots of sort of characters in the Old Testament who sort of look like they're going to do a really good job, and then a lot of them fail, but leading up to someone called Jesus who is claimed to sort of live a perfect life. All his followers, though, are really, you know, they sort of mess up a lot of the time, don't they? And his disciples, and you know, what is it? If it, you know, there might be isolated passages like that one in Hebrews where we can sort of dip in and say, lovely, it sounds like God's never going to leave me or forsake me. That comforts me. But then there's these passages like the Judges. So what is it for? What's the purpose of the Bible?
Well, if we let's look at a couple of verses and see what it says about itself. Let's start with Galatians chapter 3. So that's saying just one verse out of Galatians chapter 3. It's one of the letters of Paul. It says in verse 24 that the law was our guardian, like a schoolmaster, to bring us unto Christ, that we might be justified by faith. So I think that, you know, there's, you know, pretty succinctly in a nutshell, that's what it's supposed to do. It's
the law. So the law, what's that referring to?
That'll be the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. It's probably in this context a pretty broad term of the law and the prophets.
Okay. Just in case it's useful, my version has tutor there, which I think is quite handy.
Yeah.
Because if you think about if you had a tutor for your A-level maths or something, it's fairly obvious what they're trying to do. They're trying to teach you, aren't they?
Yeah. So it's making the point, isn't it, that the book, the text, the words on the page are not the end itself. They're there for a purpose to bring us to Christ. Okay. And that's, you know, and there's a similar idea in Hebrews chapter 1, the opening of that book. I'll take this from the English Standard Version. It says, long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things. And so it's the prophets in many times, and that's what, you know, the Bible is, lots of different collected books and writings and speeches and letters, different genres in many ways, but now in his Son, that it's all leading to that.
So it's sort of culminating in Jesus. That's what those two passages have said.
So but that means, you know, we have to bear in mind that if that's the purpose of this text, that's a fairly focused purpose, if you like, and that, you know, we perhaps shouldn't. We've got to be a bit careful that we don't expect it to be things that it doesn't intend to be, or it doesn't claim to be. You know, I think, you know, some of the examples John's used, it's not a children's storybook in many ways, although there's clearly examples of people being brought up with the scriptures, and that's good. But it isn't really for children in many ways.
Definitely. Some of those passages in the Judges.
You know, it isn't a health manual. It isn't a manual for daily tasks and daily life.
And it's probably fair to say, Paul, that sometimes that can be a perception of the Bible, can't it? Like if you see And I guess like some of them are really positive things. Like you see sort of, I don't know, like business advice from the Bible or that kind of thing, where people have clearly gone in with a very focused intent to get something out for something that's very relevant today. And it doesn't do justice to what it is really.
And just kind of bring those thoughts together. There's the verses in 2 Timothy chapter 3, which really nails, I think, the purpose of the Bible. Let's just take a look at that. 2 Timothy 3. It's verse 15. Paul is saying to Timothy, so the Apostle Paul is saying to Timothy, how from childhood you have been acquainted with the sacred writings. So he was obviously familiar with it from a child, which are able to make you wise for salvation through faith in Christ Jesus. So there's a purpose, able to make you wise for salvation. And then it says all Scripture is breathed out by God and profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, and for training in righteousness, that the man of God may be complete, equipped for every good work. So there you've got a pretty good explanation of what the Bible is for. There's quite a lot of different aspects in there which we can think of.
It's covering sort of a man or a woman's sort of spiritual health, isn't it? I suppose it's equipping someone to be godly, to do good works. In the eyes of God, it's there to make them wise for salvation, to give them wisdom, which is really very different from like you said, a health manual. It's not there to sort of dip into parts of the law of Moses and say, there you go, we should eat this, we shouldn't eat that, sort of thing.
Shouldn't eat bats.
Yes, exactly. And things like that. Or this is how you succeed in life, which is that's big business, isn't it? In parts of the world where the Bible is used and abused.
And there's quite a lot in those words. There's kind of for teaching, for reproof, for correction, and training. There's a bit of a process there, really. I think. Yes, there's learning, there's acquiring some knowledge, but then that's going to rebuke you or reprove you or kind of expose the fact that you've got some things that you need to change about yourself, and then there's training and discipline in development and growth. So
it sounds more complicated, doesn't it, than sort of just dipping into it. And today I'm feeling a bit down, so I'd like to dip into the Bible and get out a verse of comfort. That that's what I'm talking to you, asking you why do you read it? And you don't read it just because you feel down one day. You're just going to pick up a verse and pick you up. That's there's a lot more to it, isn't there? That's what you're saying.
And I guess what we haven't touched on is although we've spoken about it leading us to Jesus Christ, we haven't spoken much about what's the future that is involved with Jesus as Messiah and King. So the real reason, when you get down to it, is here's a book that is something different by a divine author that is offering something outside of just our present existence.
Okay, I'm going to change tack a little bit, and ask John a question. So in the depths of the Old Testament, in 1 Kings chapter 21, there's a passage, and this is just one passage of many that describes fairly sort of bizarre events. I say bizarre because they're ancient events, they're ancient places and cultures and people involved, and it's really quite different from what we're used to in this modern world. So in 1 Kings 21, someone called Naboth lived in a place in Jezreel. He had a vineyard, and King Ahab wanted it. And in the end, his wife Jezebel persuaded or arranged for Naboth to be murdered. And then Ahab went and took the vineyard. And there's all sorts of stuff going on in there. So the Bible, as we've seen in 2 Timothy 3, is there to make you wise for salvation through faith in Christ Jesus. That's the sort of purpose. So John, just what's 1 Kings 21 doing, for example, or other passages like it? How can those things give you wisdom?
That's a good question. And I guess before I just briefly think about that passage in question, I guess the wider question is what's the relevance of other different bits of the Bible, isn't it? That's the question. You've picked one here at random, but the question is what's the relevance of other bits of the Bible? And I think for me personally, the reason I think that there is value in these documents is because I believe that the evidence for Jesus rising from the dead is really good, and that is the grounding of my faith. And he believed that these books were special. So if that makes sense as a sort of chain.
Sure. So if you're reading 1 Kings 21, if you're reading that without any other context to it, you'd probably think nothing for me.
It's strange, isn't it? I mean, on one level, it's like if you just read it normal, without having that grounding, you go, well, it's an interesting historical insight into what's going on at the time. But then every other book does that as well, doesn't it? Like,
Sure.
you read any kind of history document for that. So I think the reason why it might be relevant is, and again, to the points we've just discussed, the points I think that Paul covered actually from Timothy, I think it was Timothy, gives a reason as to why the Bible's there. That doesn't mean to say that every single passage you can kind of read it and immediately go, well, this is immediately applicable to me in wherever you live in 2020. That's not the purpose of every single passage in the Bible, it seems to me. So I think for this passage, what you can glean is, in the wider picture, God had made some special promises to this group of people who were known as the Israelites. And this particular book is charting a period in their history when they had a series of kings, which is actually something that God didn't actually specifically want anyway. And to the point we were alluding to earlier, actually most of them are terrible as leaders. And again, that might be analogous to today, but the purpose of this document is to chart the course of Israel's history as a special nation who God gave promises to. And in this instance, it's very obviously painting out that the king who was set up wasn't any good, and him and his wife, a lady by the name of Jezebel, were not doing anything in line with what God would want, which again is back to this point that if scripture is there, or these biblical passages are there to teach us stuff about our faith and so on, these are a bad example. And yet by contrast, this chap by the name of Naboth is an incredible example of someone who remained faithful under huge duress. And there's some comfort in that, there will be times, I'm sure, for believers where they go through really tough periods. This man here lost his own life through doing so, and he's certainly not the first follower of God to do so. That doesn't mean everyone will, and it doesn't mean that necessarily all Christians will have a tough life by any means, but I think there can be some comfort in reading this, and also an appreciation of the nature of humanity. In this instance, out of what seems to be sort of petulance, almost childish petulance, someone's killed. And again, you can see that all down human history, and it maybe points to this point that actually as humans, we like to think we're really good. I'm an eternal optimist, and I'm usually wrong. That actually often humans don't shower themselves in glory. And that in this weird little narrative, you can kind of pick up these details in humanity and think, well, things aren't going well here for this nation. There's brilliant examples, but they're killed. And it leads to this point, ultimately, I think it's leading you to Jesus and saying, well, actually, we need a remedy for this. Does that make sense, any of that?
Yeah, so yeah, it does. So it's putting it in the context of a wide narrative, isn't it? That's what you're saying.
I think so, yeah. And you can read, there's other passages, quite frankly, I don't always know, I haven't got a clue sometimes why you're given so much detail. Like there's some of them, and you're a bit like, this it seems to say the same thing over and over again. Yeah. So I don't profess to know all of them, and there's just some random thoughts on this one. But I think, yeah, the wider macro picture seems to be an important one for me to come back to fairly regularly. And again, my faith is anchored on the fact that Jesus rose from the dead. I'm not requiring of myself, I don't think that Jesus or the Bible requires us to know in detail everything that goes on, or to be able to explain everything. Okay. Again, it's back to that question we asked right at the start. If you come to the Bible with expectations that you need to know everything and do everything in detail, you probably won't. But there is comfort. There's some wisdom in these narratives, I think.
But it's a classic example of those narratives that paints the characters very vividly. You've got a clear bad guy, and you've got an innocent, God-fearing man who dies, and just in that pattern of characters and events at a really simple level, that's pointing to Jesus.
True. And I think just one other point on that because of we've talked about Jesus being the kind of pinnacle here. That passage in Hebrews talks about it's all coming to Jesus. The language and the air and the cultural noise he breathed is much of it is in these Jewish scriptures, this Old Testament. So actually, to some extent, to understand the life and the work of Jesus, he is constantly feeding back to incidents in the Old Testament. Actually, he probably alludes to this particular incident in one of his parables. And actually, so you can read Jesus on a very simple level, but actually, if you have this background, it kind of makes maybe more sense of Jesus as well, which again can help us in our faith.
Sure, understood. Yeah. So another reason why it's worth reading it, on top of the fact that this is painting a picture of humanity that we ought to pay attention to, is that we might understand Jesus better, because that was his Bible that he picked up and he read, and the people he was speaking to picked up and read and talked about. So that's
we get into the air that they breathe by reading the same thing that they heard. Something like
good. Yeah, no, that's worth thinking about. Okay, similar sort of line, Paul. Numbers chapter 15. Okay, it's a passage.
Not familiar with it.
It's all about sacrifices. Okay, I mean, there's loads of sacrifices passages in the in the law of Moses that talk about, you must go and take flock. That's someone from the flock, a food offering, a burnt offering, a sacrifice. You must go and, mix up some flour and oil and go to the sacrifice. Or if you're doing a ram, you've got to do this. You've got to fulfill vows of peace offerings, etc., etc. I mean, when's the last time you sacrificed a ram?
Okay, that hasn't happened ever. But you're right. It's pretty dry, isn't it? And there's pages of that.
How do things like that
and Numbers?
Yeah, how do they teach us wisdom for salvation?
Good question. And it's pretty dry. So back to the mudslinging analogy. This is a dry bit that doesn't stick very easily. But in some ways, what keeps me coming back to the Bible, what keeps many people coming back to the Bible, is just the sheer variety of writings that we have in this collection of books of history and stories and poetry and wisdom and insight and so on. And it's helpful to keep that purpose that we saw in mind in Timothy, the instruction in righteousness. So to think about what is that piece of the text contributing to instruction in righteousness, or how does it help us to understand a human relationship with the divine, with God? And how does it help us to understand human success or failure in that relationship? And how does it help us point towards Jesus? Some of these things that we've been talking about, does it do any of that? And maybe it does, actually, in a couple of ways, because this book of Numbers, and this is a bit of an overview. It's a book that describes the wanderings of Israel in the wilderness. They come out of Egypt, but they haven't arrived at the land of Canaan, the land that they were promised. They're wandering in the wilderness, and it describes this wilderness journey, and they wander backwards and forwards, and all sorts of things happen. And this book is structured in pieces. There's events that are described, and then there's laws given, and then there's another event, and then there's some more laws given, and then there's another event, and then some more laws. And if you think about that structure, it seems to be saying, well, here's some laws, let's see if you can keep them. Events happen, no, you can't. Failure. Okay, let's give you some more laws. Maybe that'll help. Another event, no, more failure. Let's add some more laws. More events, no, more failure. And so the macro point, if you like, is no matter how many laws, no matter how many things you tell human beings to do or not do, they're going to fail and not going to keep that. So when you think about instruction in righteousness, this is sort of saying righteousness is not keeping a list of things that you must do and a list of things that you must not do. That is not righteousness. That's not going to get you anywhere. That's not going to get human beings to reflect the image of God. It's got to be something much deeper than that changes hearts and minds and the way you behave and so on. So we won't go into it, but it's a narrative about sacrifices. Well, Jesus was a sacrifice. So immediately you've got something else there as well that might explore about pointing forward to Jesus.
Yeah, that's interesting what you say about the overall narrative as well. Because just looking back, Numbers 14 is when the people rebel. They don't do what they were told to do in going into the land. And then there's all these laws. And then chapter 16
is another dramatic failure.
An uprising. Yeah. And then there's some more, chapter 18 then is duties of priests and Levites, which in the rebellion in the chapters before was someone saying, we should all be priests, we should all be holy people. Yeah, so that's really, that's interesting. So the whole, the overall structure in itself, not just, the individual passages, the overall structure is sort of teaching something quite...
And I think that says something quite important about how these things have come together and been stitched together and woven together.
Sure.
It's genius, really, or it's inspired.
I think the other thing maybe to add to that is that I don't necessarily think that God expects us, like there's some passages in the Old Testament which are long lists of names, aren't there? Or like some of the sacrifice chapters about kind of detail of the sort of Jewish law that are very, very repetitive, and it will be only minor adjustments. And I think the idea that God's expecting us to read every single word and get excited about like this tiny, at this same thing being said, all these names that you don't mean anything, I don't think that's exactly what it is for at all. In that sense, it's often to build these big, rich pictures or narratives. Yeah. You need bits in there to make sure you can pick these things up. So I think it's one of those examples where if you go to the Bible and think that on every single page something is immediately relevant to your life, it just won't do it, and you'll let down. So you've got to take it for what it is. And some of this would have been really, really useful stuff in history that maybe doesn't mean as much to us now. And we have to do a bit of digging to try and understand what it is. But I guess that's one for next week. Dan.
Cool. Yeah, that would be good. So I suppose one last sort of question to either of you. does Jesus talk about, using the Bible, or, he obviously uses the Bible loads in the Gospels. It records it and quoting it. Is there anywhere I can turn to?
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's the example of Jesus talking to the disciples on the road to Emmaus.
Yeah.
It's in Luke 24, I think.
This is after Jesus has risen from the dead, isn't it?
Yeah. So here he's talking to these two people who are still trying to get their head around what on earth has happened with Jesus in Jerusalem after he'd been taken and crucified and placed in the tomb. And now they were hearing reports that the tomb was empty and that he had been raised from the dead. And although they didn't recognize him, he talks to these two people. And in verse 25, he says, "Oh, fools and slow of heart to believe all the things the prophets have spoken. Ought not Christ to have suffered these things and to enter into his glory? Beginning at Moses and all the prophets, he expounded to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself." So he's doing. It'd be great to have a record of what he said. What scriptures did he go to and say, "Look, this is talking about me"? Maybe Naboth was on the list somewhere.
So just
the Passover lamb and all these things.
Yeah, and just to be clear, that so it says beginning with Moses and all the prophets.
Yeah.
And then there's a similar verse in verse 44.
44, I think, yeah.
When he says, everything written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms must be fulfilled. So he's referring there, or is he referring to the specific Old Testament, the Jewish scriptures, in the three sections? So the law,
I think so, yes.
Prophets, and the writings, or often known as the Psalms.
Which begins with the Psalms.
Yeah,
sure. So probably more than half of it. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. So he's literally saying, look, this Old Testament, which was the complete Bible at the time when he was walking on that road with the disciples, this Old Testament is there pointing to me. That's what he was saying. Which is what you said about Galatians and Hebrews and the other passages we looked at. So sure, okay. Yeah. It's a huge subject. I think we've gone on a bit of a journey tonight. Why you read it. Is there anything else you want to bring out, John?
I guess the only other thing to acknowledge is that I think I've probably read the Bible through 15 times or something like that. And I think my way of reading the Bible has changed over time, and I've learned more about different bits and that kind of thing. But I think the approach that we've kind of talked to tonight, I think, is a really helpful one, because I certainly remember I used to feel like if I didn't get something out of a really specific passage, I'd almost failed in that sense. And I used to put a real burden on myself to try and understand exactly what this chapter is telling me that maybe I hadn't missed before. And actually, if the purpose of Scripture is to tell us more about God and his purpose, to grow us in our faith and to bring us towards Jesus as the sort of pinnacle, I think that's a really helpful frame of reference. It also makes sure that we don't bring unfair expectations to the Bible either way, really. And so I think that's, at least for where I am now, ask me again in another 15 years, I might change my mind. But I think that's, for me now, is a really helpful and useful way of viewing the texts. And I guess in the next couple of weeks, you or whoever does them will go on to think about how you read it in more detail. I think that's a really useful thing, because, again, there's this distinction for me. The simple message of Christianity is really simple, but the Bible's quite complex, and that's okay. The message of Jesus can be taught in half an hour, 40 minutes, but the Bible is really detailed, and making that distinction, I think, is a useful step in people's life of faith.
Sure, that's something.
Yeah, I mean, there's a well-known phrase, isn't there, that the Bible is not written to us, but it is written for us. So if that's kind of getting to the same point, isn't it, John? That it's not necessarily there to.
I think so.
To pull out points for daily life. But if there's two things from this evening, I guess its purpose is to instruct in righteousness and to point to Jesus.
Good. Okay, so it's worth people reading it in a nutshell.
Absolutely.
It would have been. It would have been a surprise if we come to a different conclusion tonight.
And wrestle with it. It's not just for reading; it's for really thinking about it.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's really, really useful. Thank you. So, so much to explore, and really hope that we can do this again. So thank you both very much. To telling us why you read the Bible, and hopefully inspiring others to pick it up and read it. Maybe people have been put off by parts of the Bible before, thinking that they should get it. They're thinking they should understand what that is speaking to them. But perhaps we need to take a step back, think about the broad picture and what the Bible is presenting to us, and how it's leading us to somebody called Jesus that we've talked about. Thank you both very much. We've pretty much come to the end. So thank you everyone for logging on, for watching, for joining us, for joining the conversation. It's been really interesting conversation, and we hope to build on this and do more Bible Feed live webinars as we go along.
You've been listening to the Bible Feed podcast. Thanks for joining us. We're always keen to hear what you think and hear your questions on subjects you'd like us to discuss. Get in touch with us on our Facebook page or send us a message from our webpage at biblefeed.org and be part of the journey.